The phone rings. You run to answer it. Because if you miss the call, you might never know who it was. No caller ID, no text message, just a phone ringing somewhere in the house. And if you remember moments like that, there's a good chance you belong to a very specific generation. People born between 1976 and 1985, sometimes called Xennials, a group that grew up between two completely different worlds. And because of that, many of them quietly feel like they don't fully belong anywhere. You probably remember a few things younger generations never experienced. Memorizing phone numbers, not one or two, dozens, friends, family, your own house. You remember busy signals, calling a friend's house, and asking their parents if they were home. You remember waiting for a TV show to air, not streaming, not replay. If you missed it, you waited another week. You remember riding bikes until the streetlights came on, and knocking on a friend's door without texting first. But something strange happened as you got older. The world suddenly started changing. Computers appeared, then email, then the internet, then chat rooms, and suddenly communication wasn't happening in person anymore. It was happening through screens. You probably already know this feeling. You grew up before the internet, but you entered adulthood right when it took over everything. And that timing created something unusual. You're not quite Gen X, but you're not fully millennial either. You didn't grow up digital, but you didn't grow up offline either. You might notice this in small ways. Technology feels normal, but you still remember when it didn't exist. You use smartphones, but part of your brain still remembers payphones. You use social media, but something about it still feels strange. Because you remember when privacy was normal. Photos weren't permanent. Embarrassing moments disappeared over time. You probably even noticed generational conversations feel slightly off. When Gen X talks about childhood, some of it sounds familiar, but not exactly. When millennials talk about growing up online, that doesn't fully sound like your experience either. You're close to both groups, but perfectly aligned with neither. And this is where the psychology becomes interesting. Most people think generations are simple. Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z. But psychology doesn't work that cleanly. Sometimes a small group grows up during a major transition. Psychologists call this a microgeneration. Xennials are one of those groups. They grew up during the exact moment when two worlds collided, the analog world and the digital world. When you grow up without instant answers, your brain learns to think longer. When communication is slower, patience becomes normal. When information takes effort to find, problem solving becomes natural. But then something changed. The internet arrived. Information became instant. Communication became constant. And suddenly the world moved much faster. Xennials experienced both environments, and that shapes the way the brain processes the world. Imagine doing a school project. Early in childhood, research meant going to the library, finding books, taking notes by hand. But by the time Xennials reached high school or college, Google suddenly existed. Information became instant, so their brains learned two completely different systems of thinking. Slow problem solving and fast information access. You're not confused about technology. You adapted to two different versions of the world, and that creates something unusual, because identity usually forms around the environment we grow up in. But Xennials experienced a transition environment, the old world and the new world, which means their psychological reference point is wider than most generations. But this creates a strange side effect. Sometimes they feel like observers, watching generational culture, instead of fully belonging to it. But this reveals something much bigger about how the mind works. Take communication. Gen X often values independence and distance. Millennials often value constant digital connection, but Xennials sit somewhere in between. You understand independence, but you also adapted to digital communication. You remember when plans were simple. Call someone, knock on their door, show up. But you also learned to coordinate everything through messages and apps. This creates a psychological bridge. Xennials often understand both sides of generational conversations, older systems and modern ones, which is why something interesting happens. When generational arguments appear online, Xennials often become the translators, explaining one generation to another. You probably know someone exactly like this, or maybe someone came to mind while hearing this. Emotional insight line. You don't feel disconnected. You feel like you're standing between two conversations. But this in-between position also creates strengths, because people who grow up during transitions develop something rare: perspective. They remember how things used to work, and they understand how things work now. That combination creates a wider lens. Xennials often recognize social patterns earlier. They notice how quickly technology changes behavior. They understand the benefits of digital life. But they also remember what the world felt like before constant connection. And once you notice that difference, you can't really unsee it. You didn't grow up in one era. You grew up during the transition between two. This is why many Xennials quietly feel different from both generations around them. Not disconnected, just positioned differently. They watched one cultural system disappear and another one appear. So if you were born between 1976 and 1985, that strange feeling of being slightly between generations might actually make sense. You experienced something very few groups did. You saw the world before constant connectivity, and you adapted to the world after it arrived, which means you carry memories from two different eras: the slower world and the faster one. And once you realize that, the feeling of not fully belonging anywhere starts to look different. It isn't confusion, it's perspective. Think about that for a moment, because many people today only know one version of the world, but you experience the transition between two, and that changes how you see almost everything. So now I'm curious, when people talk about generations, do you feel clearly part of one, or do you feel somewhere in between?